Hello everyone, I'm Laurel Griffith and welcome to Sunday School. Today we are going to be in the book of Exodus, and before we begin, it's the first chapter and some verses in the second chapter. Before we begin, I want to give us a little bit of context. Exodus is one of those, my favorite books in the Old Testament, and the more I study it, the more I have begun to understand it, and so the more I love it. Exodus is actually a part of a greater book, which is called the Pentateuch, and that is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy can be considered one great unit or one big book. And Exodus is a chapter in that book. It relates to everything that has gone before in Genesis, and it points forward all the way to the point where the children of Israel stand poised to go into the promised land, which occurs at the end of Deuteronomy. So to understand where we are, we have to go back just a smidge, just quickly, to talk about Genesis. We know that God created a good world, and He filled it with good things, and He put Adam and Eve in the garden and told them to be fruitful and to multiply and to have dominion over His creation. But sin entered the world when they made the choice to do things their own way, and so they were sent out of the garden. And when sin entered the world, death and darkness came with that. So it began to spiral, and what was an individual or a couple's sin became a family sin, became a society sin, and the world was characterized by this darkness and this death. But God was not content to leave humanity, His good creation, in this manner. And so He launched a great plan of redemption and renewal, reconciliation. And it began when He intervened in history in a particular moment with a particular man named Abram. Abram, of course, would become Abraham. And you can read about this in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. God speaks to Abraham and says, "Come follow me, and I am going to make a covenant with you. I am going to make you a great family, and I am going to make you a great nation. I am going to bless you. You're going to have lots and lots of heirs, people who are going to come after you, and all the nations of the world will be blessed through you." So this is the point at which God intervenes and begins to work out His great plan of redemption. Well, we know that Genesis tells us that Abraham and Sarah give birth to Isaac, and Isaac then gives birth to Jacob and Esau, and Jacob gives birth to 12 sons who become the 12 tribes, the nation of Israel. And we know the story of Joseph, where one of those sons is sold into slavery and taken into Egypt. Eventually, after being enslaved and imprisoned, Joseph rises in power and becomes second in command in Egypt. And at a time of great famine, Joseph invites or allows his brothers and his family to come and to not only be nourished, but to settle in Egypt. So the family of Israel, Jacob becomes known as Israel, the family of Israel, the 12 sons and all of their families come and settle in Egypt. And while they are there, they prosper. They are fruitful, and they make lots of babies, and there's more and more and more of them. And this is an indication in Scripture when we see that they were fruitful and they multiplied. This is an indication that God is with them and that God has blessed them. And you see the connection all the way back to Genesis, where God told Adam and Eve to do the same thing. So here we see the nation of Israel fulfilling what God has said for them to do. They are fruitful and they multiply. This presence and blessing of God is seen on the people, and it threatens the new ruler who has come into power, Pharaoh. And Scripture tells us that this Pharaoh did not remember Joseph, was not connected to Joseph. And so he is threatened by the rise of the sheer numbers of the Hebrews. And so he decides that he is going to have to figure out a way to control some of them. And so he hatches some plans. And there's actually 3 things that he does to try to control them. So let's take a look and read and see what Pharaoh is up to. And we are in chapter 1, and we'll begin with verse 8. "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed upon them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dwelt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Here we see that Pharaoh has attempted to enslave the Hebrews, and they are being treated very brutally. They are being made to do all the horrible jobs. They are being controlled. All the brutality that slavery brings, the Israelites are suffering that. But it doesn't seem to have any effect. God is still blessing them. They are continuing to grow and to become more and more numerous. And so Pharaoh then goes into phase 2 of his plan. And phase 2 is he calls the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, and instructs them that when these women give birth, they are to kill the babies. And the midwives resist this and will not do this. And Pharaoh wants to know why. And they make these excuses about how strong and vigorous the Hebrew women are. God blesses these midwives for their courage, and the nation itself, these families continue to grow. God's presence continues to be there with them. So Pharaoh has one more trick up his sleeve, and he says in verse 22, "Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, 'Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live.'" So the final thing that Pharaoh says is, well, we'll just kill all the boys. So it seems here that it would be any child that they would see that would be male, that a young child would be thrown into the Nile. So it feels like murder in this moment that Pharaoh is instructing his soldiers or his people to carry out against the Hebrew nation. So Pharaoh's trying desperately. He is trying to enslave the people. He is trying to get the midwives to kill the babies as soon as they are born. And when neither of these things seem to affect the blessing of God upon the people and the people continuing to multiply and grow, Pharaoh then says, we're just going to kill the males outright and throw them into the Nile. So here we have evil, and in the face of evil and all the darkness and all that goes with it, the fear, all the oppression that is happening here, and it looks like that things are so bad and so painful and so sad, and that there is no way out. In the next chapter and 2, we see that God is on the move. God is still at work, and God is going to bring the next phase of his plan of rescue. He's going to begin that now with the birth of baby Moses. So let's look at chapter 2. And this part of the story, I'm sure, is very familiar to you. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The woman and the man that are Moses' parents are identified as being from the house of Levi. So this means that they are descendants of the tribe of Levi, the brother Levi, that they are a part of that particular tribe. And Scripture is intentional to make sure that we know this, and it's significant, and here is why. because the tribe of Levi, once the children of Israel are out of Egypt and at Mount Sinai, and when they are given the instructions by God for the tabernacle, the tribe of Levi will actually be the people that serve as priests in the tabernacle, and eventually as the priests that serve within the temple. So Moses is coming into the world in the line of the priesthood. And Moses, we know, is going to be the one that receives the law and teaches the law to the people. And he is also going to be the one who intercedes on behalf of the people. So he's going to serve in this way as a priest and represent God to the people, and then speak on behalf of the people to God. So here, right here in this moment, when no one recognizes that anything that is happening, that God is at work, we see that God is moving in the family of Moses, in his parents, in their the tribe that they are from. So let's continue and see what happens when baby Moses gets put into the Nile River. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." Moses' mother has been so desperate that she has made this basket, and she has covered it with tar to seal it from the water, and she has put her baby into this basket and put the basket onto the edge of the Nile River. She has tried to hide Moses for 3 months, and I'm sure that he's getting bigger, and his cries are getting louder, and it's becoming less. He's becoming more conspicuous. And so, in an act of desperation, she takes this step. She seems to be a woman of great courage, but also creativity to have figured this out. And so she puts the baby in the basket and positions the sister, who we know from later passage that the sister's name is Miriam, and Miriam stands guard. So it's interesting to know that this basket, the word that we see translated here, basket, is the same word that is used in the flood story for ark. So this basket is, in a sense, a boat or an ark that saves Moses, who will then turn to deliver his people. We know that Noah's family is saved by the boat, the ark, that Noah has been built according to God's instructions. When we see baby Moses in this basket in the Nile River, and as we read this, we should think backward and we should think ahead. And so we are looking back to the flood story, but we are also looking ahead to the time when the children of Israel are going to cross that river, and they are going to the Red Sea. They are going to cross the Red Sea, and they're going to cross on dry land all the way until they are actually set free from Egypt, and the water is going to cover over the Egyptians that are chasing them, and those who had been enslaved are now free, and they move on to Mount Sinai and ultimately to the Promised Land. So baby Moses in the Nile River, we look back to the flood story, and we look ahead to the Red Sea and to the crossing of the Red Sea. So here we have Moses' mother using her courage, her creativity, and she puts the baby in the basket, and the sister is positioned there to stand guard and to watch and to wait. And in this moment, we see the princess, Pharaoh's daughter, coming to the Nile to bathe. She's got her maids with her. She sees the basket. She calls them to bring the baby to her. The baby is crying, and it seems that this princess has a soft heart, and she is moved with compassion. And so she knows that this child is being saved from her father's instructions, and she seems to have compassion for him. Miriam pops up at just the right time and says, "Would you like for me to get a nurse for her?" Miriam goes to get her mother, who comes, and Pharaoh's daughter actually pays Moses' mother to take care of him and to nurse him for a time. So in all of this, if we did not have the perspective, I think a biblical perspective, we might say, what a series of amazing coincidences. Just look how all of this unfolded. But you and I know that this is not coincidence, but this is God at work. God's grace is at work, and God's Spirit is at work, moving in the lives of these people, shaping circumstances, intervening in history in order to not only spare Moses, but also to prepare Moses. For you see, Moses' life is spared here, but Moses now is being cared for by his mother, where he would have had the early love and nurturing of the mother, and perhaps some exposure to what it looks like to worship the one true God. And then when he is taken at some age to the princes and lives in the palace, he will there be prepared and educated in the finest Egyptian schools. He is being spared because he is living in the house with the Pharaoh, or at least under the rule of the Pharaoh. He is being spared from the brutality of slavery. He is being spared from what it might do to him physically, but also what it might do to his spirit. He is just being protected as he is in Pharaoh's house and cared for by his new mom, the princess, but he has also been prepared by his own mother. So in all of these circumstances, we see that God has been at work. And ultimately, of course, Moses is the one who God is going to call and use to bring the children of Israel out of Egyptian slavery. So in this period when things seem to be the darkest and the most desperate, when Pharaoh is unleashed, the greatest evil that he could unleash on a civilization, he is murdering the children of this civilization. And the Hebrews are enslaved, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing that they can do about it. God is at work. God is with them, and God is moving with His grace in their midst to bring about His good purposes. We can think of this or know this as God's prevenient grace, the grace that is at work even before we recognize that it is present with us. And God's prevenient grace is stirring here in this moment. You know, we have been the recipients of God's prevenient grace, where God is preparing us so that we can receive Christ, that we can receive the justifying grace of Jesus Christ. And then once we have been saved by the justifying grace of Jesus Christ, reconciled and put into relationship with God because of what Jesus has done for us on the cross, we then experience God's sanctifying grace, where we are being transformed into the image of Christ. We become the people that God intends for us to be. All of this is because His grace is at work in our lives. And so here, when I think about and reflect on this beautiful story, I think the takeaway for me, the thing that I grab hold of and treasure in my own life, is that even in the midst of the times when I think the world is spinning out of control, and whether that is personal or whether that is something that I'm looking on the international scene, or even in our own community, when I have a sense that there's darkness, when I have a sense that there's fear, that there's a crisis at every hand, I can take a deep breath and step back and say, my God is still at work. My God is moving in His world to bring about His good purposes. My God is using the people and the circumstances that are right around me to bring about good. And I have the opportunity to be a part of that when I offer Him myself, when I surrender my own life and I take my story and attach it to His great story of redemption. So it's a beautiful thing for us to remember. It's a beautiful thing for us to surrender to, that we recognize that just as God spared and prepared Moses to answer the call and to follow through with what God had for him to do, He is doing the same thing in our lives as well. So this week, may you live with confidence, knowing that our God is at work in your life. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great week. Bye-bye.